Welcome back to The Left Unsaid, everyone. We're at episode 16.
Yes, welcome to The Left Unsaid, where we rip the curtains of the bipartisan BS off the windows and let the light stream in. And this is the first time we've done this on video.
It is.
So we're pretty excited about that. Patrick McElwee, and joined by...
I'm Meg McElwee. So we're absent one of us, our teenager Finn, who you're used to hearing on the episode. You'll actually hear later on as he's going to conduct the interview that we're going to be playing for you.
And not just hear, but see.
We thought we'd show you our faces, how much we love each other.
So Finn had the chance to interview Graig Meyer, our local state senator, who's a really thoughtful politician who chose to speak up in June about what's gone on in Gaza, calling it a genocide, even though, as he'll say, he didn't feel like he had to. He could have stayed silent, and he was fearful about speaking up. But he did, and he's very thoughtful about how he approaches the issue, and I encourage everyone to watch that. Particularly, he's thoughtful about how it pertains to the growing authoritarianism and how Trump is using the issue. So if we want a movement for democracy here, it's going to remain important. But as we're having this conversation, there's a ceasefire that's taken hold in Gaza. Many less Palestinians are being killed on a daily basis, although sad to say, Israel hasn't completely stuck to the ceasefire and there have been killings. We're relieved that the ceasefire has come to an
and so happy
pass.
To see just the joy of the kids in Palestine that I see on these videos, the tears of joy, the laughter, the being out. I saw some kids roller skating out among the rubble, and just a general sense of a weight that's being lifted off of their shoulders. I'm so happy for them that they have that space to just breathe a sigh of relief. And even though our work in this arena is not over, right? It's shifting. It's going to shift.
Yeah, I just see a lot of questions out there about why there aren't more celebrations among people who are concerned about Gaza and about the genocide. And, who can celebrate after a horrific thing like this? And honestly, it's hard to celebrate when the prospect of there being real justice for the crimes that have been committed is so low. I mean, there ought to be trials, like there were trials after World War II, to punish those who had carried out war crimes. And the prospect of that is very low, although there is an arrest warrant out for Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. That's important because there's got to be restraint on Israel going forward. Israel right now still seems so emboldened. We don't know if they would attack the Palestinians further. We don't know if they would attack Jordan or Syria or Lebanon or any other, or Iran or anybody else in the Middle East.
Right. Really what this is a slowing down of attacks on Gaza. But, there's nothing to be said of the occupied territories in the West Bank. It's still an apartheid state. It's still a colonialist project. It's still, a religious ethno state. Like they still have separate justice systems for the Palestinians versus the Israelis. It's not like this ceasefire is like we can all just sigh and go about our merry ways and not continue to think about this and to advocate for the Palestinians, because as we've talked about between ourselves, it's related. It's linked. What's going on here and the oppression that's happening in the U.S. and what's going on there.
That's a good segue to this New York Times article that came out this morning with the headline, "A Test Now for Israel, Can It Repair Its Ties to Americans?" And first to note is just the way in which the New York Times presents itself and just sees itself as making the case always for Israel. And the whole article is that way. Nowhere in this article does anyone make the case for why Americans ought to have something less than a rosy relationship with ethno-state, with a colony that was set up in the land of Palestine to be a Jewish majority state. And all the dangers that comes from that. Now, I'm not saying there isn't some universe in which that can be worked out to some degree, but we've seen the dangers of a Jewish ethno-state play out over the last 2 years to all of our horror. And that's nowhere in this article. But I think what it foretells and what it shows is that there's going to continue to be a major push to capture the U.S. political system.
And they are worried about the loss of people 30 and under. There are several American-born Israelis that they quote in there, which is interesting if you think about it. American-born Israeli in the university setting, they said, that what's surprising is that these activists have been able to convince people that this is a genocide, non-political. People who tend to be non-political feel like they are concerned with the concept of a Jewish state to begin with. And it got me thinking about just a little thought experiment, which is, how would you feel to live under a Christian ethno-state? And this is not...
I mean, we might get our chance. We might get our chance to find out.
Right? Like, how would you feel if the Christian nationalist ethno-state sent in troops to a blue area and then, either started kidnapping people and trying them outside of what we know as our judicial system?
I mean, is that a thought experiment, or is that what's happening in Chicago?
That's the point. Like, that is what's happening here. That's what's happening in Portland. Like, this is happening here. How do you feel if the Christian ethno-state comes in and says, oh, you can't teach about slavery because that might make white Christian nationalists feel bad about their forebears and might make them question the entire narrative of our history here in the United States. So this is not really a thought experiment, obviously. It's happening here. Being under the rule of a Christian nationalist power structure doesn't feel good. And it's not a healthy democracy.
Well, it's especially dangerous if your goal is to have a demographic majority in the land. And
it's linked here, right? Because the goal of all this crackdown on immigration, only allowing white Afrikaners in as refugees.
Yeah, and I think it's linked because there is, within the MAGA movement and within this deportation push, within the rise of the far right in the United States, this great replacement theory that the Democrats or liberals or the left are intentionally bringing in immigrants to make demographic change, to change the fundamental political character of the United States, which they characterize as being a change from the true sort of Americans that descend from who? The settlers. And there we see the settler colonial nature of the United States as a project. And Israel is similar to that. It's newer. It's much more raw. The genocide is happening today, or maybe yesterday, hopefully put on indefinite pause. But the genocidal logic remains, because if you want to have a Jewish majority in the land of Palestine, well, they've been very successful at getting a large number of Jewish people to move there over the last 75 years. So that now you have about 7 million Jewish Israelis, and then about 7 million other people who currently live in the land of Palestine. Now, some of that is officially occupied by Israel, but they haven't been treating it like occupied territory that they're eventually going to give up. And they've been treating it with increased settlements in the West Bank, with the siege, the blockade of Gaza, with the genocide in Gaza, as a land that they intend to continue to exercise control over. So we'll see, but it just seems like the possibility of a two-state solution has been made so unworkable by Israel that it's hard to see anything but an end to ethno-supremacy as an outcome here. I don't know. Maybe there'll be some path toward a two-state solution, but is it going to be anything that's other than subjugation of the Palestinians under somebody like Tony Blair? War criminal from the Iraq war days, and a prime example of why it's important to go after these criminals and hold them to account, because they just keep coming back over and over and over. I mean, I just can't believe it. Someone who lived through the Iraq war, seeing Tony Blair coming back as like the name put forward for the colonial ruler of Palestine, it's just incredible. So yeah, I find this, if you read through, I highly recommend reading through this New York Times article about how the forces behind this project, the Zionist project of Jewish supremacy in the land of Palestine, how they see the battle for the hearts and minds, you could say, of Americans, for the political system of the United States, as the battle for Israel itself. Because it's like the only thing now standing between this massive tide of public opinion across the world and their ability to continue to exercise occupation, apartheid, and this just spasm of 2 years of genocidal violence.
The push is now, and it says so in this article, the push is now for the hearts and minds of Americans, and there's going to be, there's already been a consolidation of media control by Israeli-backed folks here in the U.S., so you see TikTok being purchased by pro-Israel money. We also see CBS News being purchased, and Barry Weiss, who made her name as a Colombian student, calling out professors for so-called antisemitism, which was misconstrued. What she was really calling out was criticism of Israel. That was being conflated with anti-Semitism. Well, now she's being rewarded after having gone off and made her own media outlet called the Free Press that's just so backed by billionaires. Not so much readership, but the readers that count, right? The ones with billions of dollars to spend. Well, now she's been set up and she's the head of CBS News. So we see mainstream legacy media, but also sources like TikTok, Elon Musk owning X, formerly Twitter, Zuckerberg with Meta,
with Instagram and Facebook. So the danger of this shutting down our internal debate is real. And we are facing this authoritarian threat here in this country. And it's all connected, frankly. So we'll continue to be talking about that here at The Left Unsaid, producing content related to that. But we want to turn now for this episode to the interview that Finn did a few months ago with Graig Meyer, conducted this interview back in July. And it's in the context of some surprising developments here in North Carolina, where the state party actually adopted a resolution urging the end of all military shipments to Israel while it commits genocide and apartheid. And Graig Meyer really connects it in his article to Trump's authoritarianism and the use of anti-Semitism as a weapon in bad faith to push that authoritarianism here. And Finn was asking him in the context of some of the struggles that he's been facing in his high school, where he wasn't allowed to say the word genocide. So I think we just go to that interview, and I think you'll find it very thoughtful and a good example of how one consequence of this genocide has been shifts in the opinions of middle Americans and rather centrist Democrats as well.
So you wrote this wonderful op-ed recently, and I thought it was very well written. It definitely spoke to me a lot. What was the process like for you making the decision to write this piece? What led you to that moment?
So I'm a state senator. I'm not a member of U.S. Congress. We don't play a role in foreign affairs, and the historic conflict between Israel and Palestine and Israel's neighbors is something that has always bothered me, but I haven't ever really known what to do with it. It wasn't my thing. I'm not interested particularly in international affairs as a primary political interest, and that particular set of conflicts is so complex that I stayed away from it. I decided to speak up on it now because I feel like President Trump is using claims of attacking anti-Semitism in order to advance his authoritarian agenda. He is using anti-Semitism as the excuse to crack down on education and free speech in particular. And I think that the connection of Trump's weaponization of anti-Semitism to the U.S. support for Israel's war in Gaza has really complicated things in domestic politics, where I do have more expertise and more care. And I have come to believe that I don't think we can stand up to Trump's authoritarianism without it also addressing the way that the genocide in Gaza is connected to it, both in terms of U.S. foreign policy and in terms of political rhetoric. That if we're going to be resistant to authoritarianism here at home, we have to talk about the cycle of violence that exists, that includes the genocide in Gaza, as well as anti-Semitic violence towards Jewish people here in the United States, and Trump's use of anti-Semitism as a weapon word. All of those things are linked, and it's really hard to figure out how they're linked, and I wanted to take a shot at pointing out the ways that they are.
One of the things that I've noticed, and a lot of people have noticed, is that this issue in particular is very hard in the political climate of the United States to speak out about and to even have discussions about. You said that you were afraid venturing into this topic. Can you talk a little bit about why you were afraid, what kind of fears you had going into this?
I think if you speak up publicly with any particular side, or anything that's perceived as a side, on Israel and Palestine, you are going to get criticized from people who feel that they have a stake in whatever the other side is. And I knew that as a state senator, it would be easy for me to say nothing. This isn't my issue. It's an issue for members of U.S. Congress, not for the North Carolina General Assembly. But I do feel like there's a role that I have to play in political leadership about speaking to how we stand up against the rise of Trump's authoritarianism. And I had to decide, was it worth it to take the risk to say the things that I truly believe, to try and show a path forward, knowing that I would get criticized not just by people who are always political opponents of mine, but criticized by people who are normally political allies of mine, who agree with me on many things, because mostly I talk about domestic policy stuff or North Carolina issues that they can agree on, but when it comes to talking about Israel and Palestine, that they would likely disagree with me. And in fact, they did. I received a significant amount of pushback and disagreement and some very emotional reactions, as well as a significant amount, and actually probably an even larger amount, of appreciation and affirmation.
This is obviously a very important and big decision that you've made. How has your feelings watching, what's happening to Gazans and Palestinians in general, how did that play into your decision to speak up?
So I'm a lifelong pacifist. I'm anti-war of all forms. I try to be anti-violence as much as possible. I also understand that with a basic stance of pacifism, that you also have to have some ability to see gradations of what types of violence are necessary, as certainly in response to certain instances. But in general, I oppose all wars. And in this case, I unilaterally oppose the terrorism that Hamas has inflicted on Israelis, and I unilaterally oppose the war that Israel has brought on Palestine. And I stated that in what I wrote, but that type of both things are bad doesn't do full justice to explaining what's happening in the situation right now, because our debate here in the United States isn't about both things are bad. Our debate is about how bad is Israel's war. In this case, Israel has become the aggressor. They have the power. They have caused a greater amount of harm and destruction, and there seems to be no end in sight to their war. And I think that there is a question then that arises for someone who wants to speak out on it, on what do you say and how do you say it. And it's one thing just to say I oppose it. It took me a much longer time to get to the place where I decided to call it a genocide, because that's a really weighty word. It's a hard one to use, and it's particularly hard to use in a situation that is related to the state of Israel, a state that was created in response in part to a previous genocide, the Holocaust. But in this case, I felt like if I was going to address the issue, I needed to do the intentional reflection to figure out what it was that I really felt and what I wanted to say. And I did decide that I couldn't find a better word to use than genocide, that I think that my observation of the harms done to the Palestinian people and their ability to live freely has crossed over from a war into an outright attempt to eliminate their places to live, their ability to live, to thrive, and it certainly has taken thousands of lives at this point. And so I chose to identify what was happening as a genocide. And I've had a lot of correspondence with people since then who disagree with me about it being a genocide, but do agree with me that there are significant critiques to be made of Israel's aggression. They're mostly Jewish people who don't want to be lumped in with Benjamin Netanyahu's government and the state of Israel's official actions, which I understand. And I tried not to conflate the issue of Jewish people with what Israel is doing. But what I also found was that some portion of those people were objecting to the word genocide, but suggesting or offering other words that I found to be also objectionable. You can call it a humanitarian disaster. You can call it any euphemism you want for war or loss of life. And I don't find solace in any of those words. So if you don't want to call it a genocide, that's fine. You can call it what you want to call it. But I'd certainly hope that you don't feel better by naming it as something else. It's just another word for death.
You mentioned the Holocaust, and actually, like a lot of the reasons why I put myself forward as an activist in spaces where it may not be easy is this wonderful Holocaust education that we're given in schools. You've worked in public schools for a long time. You're a state senator now. Why do you think it's so important to teach about the Holocaust and other past genocides for our kids now?
Yeah, and I was in the General Assembly when we passed the law that required Holocaust education in our schools. I would love there to be a full telling of many different ways that the U.S. and other powerful entities in the world have brought harm through war and genocide and destruction, because I think that in order to avoid those types of things in the future, you have to study the past and learn from them, and you have to find ways to learn enough about other people to find empathy for them, empathy enough that you choose not to kill them. And education to me is the number one thing that we can do to help people to have empathy for others, because you can't always meet everyone, but you can at least learn about them. And then the second thing is we have to have ways for people to actually get to know one another, exchanges, diplomacy, etc., where you can build relationships that break down fear and barriers and break down hatred and lead to possibilities for conflict resolution when necessary that don't rely on violence. I think it's a very important part of high school education to examine important moral questions, including what are the things that no one or no society should ever do? And if you're an everyday citizen and you see your society taking part in that, what do you do? What's your responsibility? When is it your responsibility to speak up? How do you gather with other people to organize opposition to state-sanctioned and funded death? murder and war? And when do you decide to take risks to your own reputation, to your relationships, in order to speak up against something that you find to be morally repulsive? And in traditional public school education, we don't teach with a morals forward lens like private schools do. But when you teach U.S. history, world history, any element of social studies, there is an implicit moral lens. And the question is it an implicit moral lens that you're teaching that one society, one country, one group of people, one set of rulers are better than the others, and that you want allegiance to them and you should support them no matter what they do, including if they inflict harm on others? Or are you teaching what has traditionally been the American ideal, that we are a group of people who try to work together to solve things through democratic processes rather than through violence, and that in general we have barriers, restrictions, and even punishments for people who try to solve conflicts with violence within the United States? If you do that within our country, you are put into the court system and possibly punished, including incarceration. In the international sphere, that's a little more difficult. We do have international courts, etc. But if we are going to live up to our American ideals, we still should be teaching young people that we can solve our conflicts, including our world conflicts, through forms of democracy, cooperation, collaboration, and that we should strive to end wars and end genocides.
I full-heartedly agree with you. Actually, last year I had this amazing class. It's called Modern Global Conflicts, where I think we were asking a lot of the right questions. We were looking at previous genocides. We're saying, how can we prevent future genocides? What should the United States do? What should we do as individuals? But one instance I was really very shocked at and dismayed at was that we were doing a presentation on genocides. You could pick a genocide to present to the class about. And it was towards the end of the school year. I wanted to do mine on Gaza and on what was happening there. And my teacher was initially okay with it, which I thought was great. But there ended up being a lot of pressure. Someone had found out about it. A pro-Israel lobbyist had found out about it and was going to the school board and attacking this class in particular, because this class also did deal with Israel-Palestine as a conflict, and actually the class ended up being canceled. We had an instance where one pro-Israel activist was calling my teacher every day in class. From your perspective, as someone who's worked in public schools and a state senator, is that normal behavior for lobbyists that want to, get their position across?
Some people are exhausting. I want to give you a general answer first, and then I can get to the specifics of like the locals in your class. But we create institutions of education to give young people an age-appropriate space to be able to deal with the complex issues of the world. When they're in college, we specifically send them away so that they're in a little bubble by themselves, so that they can work out all the kinks of that stage of late adolescence, explore all the issues of the world, go from one extreme to the other in a period of time where hopefully they come out at the other end ready to be a participating member of a functioning democracy. And so we should have a high degree of tolerance for young people in high schools and college who are exploring ideas and taking strong positions on them as young people do and as they should, and testing those against what other people are thinking, feeling, doing, saying, what they believe, what they've experienced about the world. And we should use these laboratories of schools as a chance to teach people how to do that in a way that is open to disagreement but not harmful to others. And so you do need parameters in place that say, hey, you've gone too far when you go to do this or say this. And those are really hard to determine. What are the right lines to draw? And when things go into the gray area, what is the right way to deal with it? But what we shouldn't do is tell young people that they can't talk about these things at all, or have adults punish young people for trying to learn. We should let young people and support young people to grow and learn with the guidance of teachers and others around them. And when young people have conflicts where they hurt each other's feelings, when they say things that are inappropriate, we should use that as an opportunity to help them to learn how to resolve those things and heal the wounds without resorting to violence. I think that President Trump's administration is trampling over all of that by trying to force certain compliance with codes of speech that is antithetical to what we believe is the space that universities are for, to have debates about things and let people learn, even when it's hard, how to exist with one another without harming one another. And in doing so, he is taking away traditional openness to freedom of speech and to academic independence and to interrogation of power and harm and evil that we generally depend on this society as a key piece of a functioning democracy that we deliver through education. I think that's a very dangerous piece of authoritarianism. In high schools, we have a little bit more restrictions that we put on students because they're a little bit younger. And we try to make sure that as they explore difficult things, that they do it in a way that they're not going to be harmful to others and sometimes to themselves and what they learn about. We don't want you to learn about certain things before you're a certain age because we think it can be harmful to you. But it's no surprise that someone who's about to be old enough to be drafted to go to war might be thinking about whether a conflict in the Middle East would have an impact on their lives and what stance they want to take on it, and what our government and what our country should do about it. And so we have to engage in that type of education on international politics, psychology, morality, all of these things to help young people understand how to navigate this world. And I don't think it's appropriate for people to interrupt that education process because of their own political or religious ideology, that they want to stop the educational process for others. I think there's a more important lesson here for young people like you, Finn, which is for any time that someone decides that it is their civic duty to speak truth in the face of power, you have to decide how much risk you're going to take. And when you take any risk, you have to be willing to accept the consequences of it. Nonviolent resistance requires us to make sacrifices that we do specifically because we are not able to get what we want through a normal democratic process. And so you walk out of class, or you do civil disobedience, or whatever the things are that have to get in the way. And you have to know when you're doing that, you're doing it with consequences coming. So when students on campuses were boycotting their final exams, and then they got mad that they didn't have grades because they didn't take their final exams, they were probably a little bit off base. If you want to boycott your final exams, that's your form of civil disobedience, then you have to be okay with not having a grade because you didn't participate in the process. And you're doing it specifically to not be in compliance with what they want. And you have the opportunity now to do something that is going to break the rules. There may be consequences for you, and you're doing it because it's worth it.
Last two questions then. What is your biggest fear for the future? And then with that, what is your biggest hope?
My biggest fear is that Trump's authoritarianism will continue to increase its power, and he will continue to use wedges like antisemitism, which he's turned into a wedge, and the situation in Gaza as a way to divide American people and to justify continued exercise of power, both here in the U.S. and abroad, that brings harm. And my hope is that we'll see a popular uprising from folks here in the U.S. that will resist that type of authoritarianism and recognize that we can grapple with difficult issues through democratic processes and not give too much power to people like Benjamin Netanyahu or Donald Trump.
Well, that's this episode 16 of The Left Unsaid.
Thanks for joining us.
And if you are listening to this podcast and you want to see a video, you can jump over to our YouTube channel. Just search for The Left Unsaid on YouTube. You should be able to see it there. I'm not totally sure how the dissemination of this video is going to work. It's a bit of an experiment. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.